Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this FSR energy policy debate. My name is Ilaria Conti, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to today's debate, which will focus around the new shaping of European energy policy. So the last 2 years have been particularly interesting, particularly hectic, even in terms of events affecting also the energy markets in Europe. And consequently, we have seen the publication and of several initiatives at European energy policy and regulatory level. Today, we will focus in particular on the Fit for 55, which is now in approval phase. It was published, as you may remember, in 2021, sort of first part in July, and the second part focusing more on hydrogen and the decarbonized gas markets in December. But at the same time, we've seen the outbreak of the war in Ukraine after the invasion of Russia, and basically the world has changed since then. So we had also other initiatives, such as the Repower EU communication in May last year, in May 2022, which proposed amendments to deal with the energy crisis, of course, which was a consequence also of the Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So, in fact, the scope of today's debate is, if you want, twofold. We will make a sort of recap of an assessment where we are with all these regulatory and policy initiatives. And also we will try to look forward. What is missing? What are really the priorities right now? What should decision makers address as first urgencies? And we will do so with many distinguished speakers. I will just introduce my fellow companions here. Andris Piebalgs, you see here. He will be moderating the whole debate. And Christopher Jones, who will introduce this topic with a comprehensive presentation. Christopher, you have the floor. Enjoy the debate.
Thanks very much, Ilaria. So what I'd like to do is to go over the remaining, the elements of the Green Deal, the Fit for 55 that are remaining for discussion between the Council and Parliament. Ask the question, what remains, what are the points of potential disagreement and what's the solution? And then ask the question, okay, what's next? So when you look at how comprehensive the Green Deal is, it's easy to lose sight about how much actually is changing. And I borrowed this slide from somebody that actually explains this. So this is actually a fairly comprehensive, it's not everything's in there, but it's a fairly comprehensive view of the changes that are facing European industry. And when you see it like this in 3 different areas, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, basically, product design reform, use of energy and greenhouse gas emissions, which is what we think of the Fit for 55. And often we just focus on the Fit for 55 as energy folks. But actually, it's linked to so much more. If you look at the release of the other pollutants, those pieces of legislation are really quite important. And then you get to the sustainable corporate governance and practices. These are, in a way, just as important as the Fit for 55. You know the taxonomy, but the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive basically require corporations of medium size and large to set Paris relevant targets and then to report on what they're actually doing in order to achieve them and make sure that what they're promised is compatible with what they're actually doing. So if you look at this, this is a phenomenal change from where we were when this commission started work. And what you see here is going to happen or has already happened. So let's start looking at them. First of all, ETS and CBAM, that's now done. The Council and Parliament have now agreed. the decision has been made. And this is a huge change. It's a huge change because firstly, the speed of removals of allowances is compatible with 55%. In fact, it's compatible with more than 55% because the ETS sector has to do some of the heavy lifting. And the CBAM changes a great deal. It protects European industry from cheaper imports. It enables us to bring energy-intensive industry fully into the ETS, so getting rid of free allowances gradually, but quite quickly, before the end of this decade, which will push these industries, the energy-intensive industries, into the hydrogen market, into the renewable electricity market, into the energy efficiency market much more aggressively. The only thing that's not done here, of course, is the fact of the ETS is going to make European energy-intensive and other industry more expensive compared to its rivals. And there is nothing in the CBAM in terms of export credits in order to balance this. The agreement says, yes, we will look at this and we will try and find a solution, but nothing's there for WTO reasons. But also the fact that the ETS now covers buildings and road transport is a huge change. It's a huge change. They're separate ETS systems. So you have ETS 1, ETS 2, ETS 3. But this is a huge change. And this is a big, big, big result for the Commission. It's kind of gone under the radar what this actually means. But what it means to you and me is that if we are heating our house from oil or gas, our bills are going to go up in 5 or 6 years and push us to the correct solution. So then the RED 2. Here the main disagreements between the Council and Parliament are the headline target. What is the legally binding obligation for the EU as a whole to ensure that it meets renewables in its energy system? The Parliament wants 45%, the Council wants 40%. So, fairly easy, 42.5%. That is really, really ambitious and would be a great result, but it's basically done at the end of the day. There's a lot of shouting to be finished, but this is basically done. Now, then we go to the Energy Efficiency Directive. Again, really, really important, the most difficult part of the decarbonisation agenda, I always think. Again, the headline target is one of the key elements of disagreement between the Council and Parliament. This will be a difficult one. The Commission proposed 13%. The Parliament proposed 14.5%. The Council has proposed 9%. So there's a lot of room between Council 9% and the Parliament 14.5%. So we'll probably end up with 13% was the Commission's objective. 12.5%, 13% go with the Commission's, but that is patently doable by the end of this year. Then we have the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. For me, this is probably the most difficult and most important piece of legislation. Because if we don't decarbonise our buildings by 2050, we're going to be nowhere close, nowhere close. I think I'm correct in saying that buildings account for about 30% of our emissions, something like that. So you don't decarbonise this, you're not done. And one of the key pieces of legislation here, there's two things. One is a date by which all new buildings have to be carbon zero, which makes them a lot more expensive, a lot more difficult, but cheaper in the long term, okay? The Commission says 2030, Parliament says 2025, Council says 2030. That is easily doable. There we can find the solution. The more difficult problem, I think, is here, is the Commission has proposed that Member States have an obligation to ensure that all non-residential buildings go from the current level F to what is equivalently the level, I think it's D, E or D, by 2030. So the Member States will have an obligation to ensure that all our buildings, if you're sitting in a building at home that is an F or an E, is upgraded to a D, which is really tricky. And this is also that for so residential would be 2030, and similarly residential a bit later, a bit lower level. The Parliament has proposed to increase the level of this ambition. So to say that the certification has to be a higher level and earlier, okay, depending. And the Council has said, no, we don't want that. We don't want that. We want a much lower obligation, which is an obligation of results, sort of. So this will be a big battleground, but to be honest, I know this is politically really, really, really tough and really difficult, but if we don't get that done, we will never decarbonize our buildings. Point. It's the really tricky one, but it really needs to be done. Then refuel aviation and maritime. This is the one where the Commission proposed to set minimum blending obligations for sustainable aviation fuels and synthetic aviation fuels for aviation and maritime. Maritime obviously limited to a certain extent to ensure competition. But the targets are really ambitious, 5% by 2030, 32% by 2040, and 63% by 2050. The Council and Parliament are normally in the same ways, but there is a solution. The solution will be around the Commission's proposal. Okay. Then we have the gas and electricity market reform, where the key areas of discussion are unbundling, but it looks like both the Council and the Parliament will accept in their reports, in their proposals, that the ITO model is available without a limit in time, in which case that will not go to the trilogues for discussion. That's done. Then you have the Quo Vadis, so no tariffs on interconnection points. Then you have so obviously the Greens and the Socialists in the European Parliament is looking for a gas phase-out date. We don't know yet whether the plenary will accept that. The obligation to accept blended hydrogen, natural gas 5%, Parliament is moving towards 2%, and the tariff discounts. These are not huge areas of discussion at the end of the day, and a solution to these will absolutely be found. Remember that if a solution isn't found by next March, basically, when the Parliament shuts down for its elections, it's done. So all of these will be basically done by the end of the year. Then we have the whole raft of energy security measures. Okay, we all know those; they're done. I think we have a robust and balanced reaction to the gas crisis. That's to a large extent done and stable. The phase down, we'll see when and how that happens. Current gas prices around 60, 65 indicate the worst is done, but nobody knows what's going to happen in the next gas filling season. But at the moment, we are looking happy. So what's the conclusion that you get from this? That is that what we see here is, although there's a lot of shouting to be done in the Council and Parliament, this is pretty much done at the end of the day. And on paper, at least, it gives us a pretty robust approach, legislative-wise, of what can be done at the European level to meeting the goals of Fit for 55. I personally think it's impressive, balanced, and well done. So the next questions is, okay, how to make sure that this actually does turn into the 55% we're looking for, and what Europe is looking for in terms of an industrial and social solution to actually implementing these in practice. And I just have sort of a few comments on what I would just noted down, and what are the next challenges, or what are the challenges. And I would say number one is, once you've got the RED 3 and the targets, and once you've got the Energy Efficiency Directive, and once you've got the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, is actually implementing them in practice. Because this is always the difference and the difficulty between what happens in Europe and what happens in America. Because in Europe, at the European level, we set the targets, and then they're met at the national level. We set the state aid rules, and then the state aid is done at the national level. In the US, as we've seen with the Inflation Reduction Act, at a federal level, they solve it in one pen stroke and put us on the back foot. And so the real question is, will member states actually be able to make their national energy and climate plans compatible with the RED 3 targets, and the Energy Efficiency Directive. And this is the million-dollar question, because at the moment, the targets that the member states have in their kneecaps are not compatible with the RED III targets. Certainly not, and in relation to energy efficiency, you'll remember in the last National Energy and Climate Plans, the main point of contention between the Commission and the member states in reviewing it is that on energy efficiency, to put it bluntly, the Commission found that many member states, the emperor had no clothes, that they had energy efficiency targets, but not the measures to implement them. How will they actually achieve these much higher and more aggressive targets? This is the million-dollar question. At the moment, if you look at what Wind Europe and others say, is we are nowhere on course in terms of renewables to meet these renewables targets. And every year we fall back, it means you have to end load it more. And so here, for me, is the biggest challenge in meeting the Fit for 55 targets. And that is where a change of direction is really, really needed. It is not that it can't be done, it's just that we need a change of direction. Secondly, you'll recall in the RED II, there is an obligation, the Commission has proposed, an obligation on member states to ensure 50% of the industrial hydrogen used is sourced from renewable sources. The Council, the Council has basically agreed with that, and the Parliament has proposed 75%. In the Repower EU strategy, we have these targets, these aspirations of 10 million tonnes of green hydrogen produced in the EU by 2030 and 10 million tonnes imported. As Ronnie will no doubt, Ronnie did a brilliant study, which is to ask, will we have enough renewable electricity by 2030 and beyond in the EU to meet our direct electrification needs and hydrogen? And the answer is no. So it will be very difficult to produce the hydrogen we need, the renewable hydrogen we need in the EU. So the Commission is intending to do a hydrogen bank with probably 3 billion from the ETS based on the German H2 Global. However, the more you look at it, importing hydrogen, aside from ammonia for the use of ammonia, rather than ammonia for cracking into hydrogen, is really tricky. If you import ammonia to then use it as hydrogen, ammonia is by weight basically 2 parts nitrogen, 1 part hydrogen. So you're importing 2 parts of the hydrogen you don't need, and then you're having to lose energy to crack it. So it's a really expensive way of importing hydrogen. Through pipelines, not going to happen over the next few years. Hydrogen natural gas boats, there's one in the world at the moment potentially going from Australia to Japan, but it uses more energy to transport it than the energy that it has that it's transporting. So you're left with refumbos, and the draft delegated act for refumbos makes it very difficult to produce qualifying refumbos outside the EU because it's really difficult to get the carbon dioxide you need to produce the refumbos. So there's some real challenges and questions here in relation to hydrogen that need to be looked at carefully. The next question I'd say is, and this will be really interesting for the next Commission, what will be the 2040 target? Because the next Commission has to set this, because the next Commission ends in 2030 when we have to start. So what should it be? And then also, what should be the next measures? We have to start thinking about those. The next one is how to deal with the Inflation Reduction Act. We have all heard stories and credible stories about a European corporate rethinking about where to focus your low carbon investments, because the IRA gives you tremendous advantages to doing into the US. And the Commission has proposed a review of the state aid guidelines, because at the moment, under the state aid rules, you cannot give selective tax breaks. So you cannot simply say, I want to give a tax break to this given industry. It doesn't work like that. And so you can't do exactly what the Americans are doing in Europe under the state aid rules today. So we need a serious rethink about how we're doing this. Otherwise, we are going to get left behind. And the last one I would question is carbon capture and storage. The commissioner at the last CCUS forum in Oslo at the end of last year said very clearly, no CCUS, no net zero by 2050. But we are nowhere along the path that will get us to where we need to be by 2030. So the Commission has indicated its intention to do a CCUS vision or strategy next year. This will be really important. So that was my whirlwind tour of the state of play and some thoughts of where we are. If any of the audience has any specific questions on the or comments on where we are in terms of the negotiation and what should be the landing zone, that would be really, really interesting to hear. So, Andries, on that, I will pass back over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Christopher, for very comprehensive and very, very rich report. Before going to the debate, there is one question, Christopher, but it is, I don't know how well you will be able to answer it. It's a rather easy question. When we could expect the final version of RED III directive? It's Jana is asking. So do you have dates or estimations or any forecasts?
I guess the question is focused as much on the additionality and the GHG requirements for Refumbo's delegated act as anything else. So there's two sides, because the RED II without the delegated act, there's no use, and of course we need the final agreement on the RED II, and all these things are interlinked, because the Parliament has said that the Parliament's proposed amendments also focus on the, or initially focused on the delegated acts. The thing about as you know, the delegated acts are really, really tricky to get this balance right, both on additionality and on GHG. Probably GHG is as much is fundamentally important, as much as important as additionality, even if it's been less the subject of discussions. I understand that the Commission is finalising these fairly shortly, but we've heard that a few times before, because it is so difficult to get the balance. Whatever the Commission does here, they'll be criticised for getting it wrong, so one has to have a lot of sympathy for them. My guess is that the RED III will be concluded certainly by the end of this year, and I would hope September, October, because this is probably the most urgent, because at the end of the day, as I said, until you have the RED III, you don't have the obligation for member states to put their national energy and climate plans compatible with the RED III, which is mean they're always lagging behind the new targets. So I would personally hope the Council and Parliament will prioritise this, which I understand they're doing, certainly the Swedish presidency. So I would personally hope we'd already get something by summer.
Okay, by summer. The whole package, would you agree with me that they need to conclude everything by end of the year?
You have some wriggle room. You can do it until February, March, before the Parliament breaks off for the political discussion. But I'm sure the Spanish presidency will be pushing to get everything wrapped up. My guess personally is, if we look at the things that are left, the energy taxation directive will be quite tricky, but that's just for the council, of course. That's not for the Parliament. Am I right there? I think I'm right. And I think, personally, I think the energy taxation directive and the performance of buildings will be the most tricky ones that might go to the wire. I think the rest will be concluded by the end of the year.
Okay. Good. So now we can go to the debate. We have three excellent panelists that they are not quite often guests in our debates. We have Lisa Fisher from E3G, we have Jesse Scott from Hertie School, and we have Ronnie Bellmans. Ronnie, you can turn your camera, please. He was from KU Leuven or Energiejuwel, but now he's from his FSR. So we have three panelists. Christopher tried really to connect all three questions that I would like really to go through the debate. I think one is still legislative process. Even if Christopher said, well, impressive, balanced, well done, still he believes that there will be some fights. So I would like the insight from panelists to say, well, how do you see? Do you see easy riding, or is there something that you believe was the missed opportunity, or something that pleased you immensely, that it was really agreed upon? So I think that is let's start with legislative, then move to the block of implementation. Because Fit for 55 will stay as a legislative act if it will not be implemented. Christopher already addressed a bit of it, but still, we need to implement. How to implement it, what difficulties we could have. And the third block is looking outside our borders. With CBAM, we move differently. Also, Inflation Reduction Act, should we be happy or unhappy about it? So that would be the third block. So I would still like to start with legislative block. And Lisa, you have the floor. So how do you see this developments about Fit for 55 legislation? Are you satisfied, dissatisfied? And what singles would you like to single out? Lisa.
Yeah, thanks, Andres, and thanks for hosting the debate. I think it's really timely to take stock just before we're wrapping up everything, and as we're starting to think about what the next commission might need to do on the climate and energy agenda. But it also made me think about sort of where did the Green Deal actually come from? And also, Christopher, I want to say that the slides that you brought up, it is and was a massive package. So also just congrats to everyone who's been involved in negotiating and putting a lot of effort into it. I think we also have to honor that. A lot of people's time goes into that. But yeah, the Green Deal originally came in response to the Fit for 55 movement and much more general mobilization of the public in favor of climate action. And I wanted to recall that because it's not only important in terms of the detail of the files, but it's also important that we kickstarted that process at that point in time, because it meant now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it meant we were ready. We had processes underway that helped us and are helping us to disconnect our economy from fossil fuels incrementally. Which means a much stronger political response was possible to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I just wanted to recall that bigger context. And I think that in itself is an achievement. The Green Deal is not perfect. I think there's a lot we can point out in terms of failures, but I think the timing and making sure we were ready and going that direction and sort of, let's say, comprehensively and steadily in that direction meant a much better, stronger political response was possible right now. In terms of sort of things I'm pleased about, Andres, you asked, I mean, the two things I wanted to highlight. One thing, I think, Christopher, wasn't on your slide, the climate law itself and the targets to 2030 it established, and the governance system, the establishment of the European Scientific Advisory Board on climate are absolutely necessary for that stability on climate legislation and consistency across climate and energy. Going forward, it really brought the EU governance system to standards we've seen elsewhere, like in the UK around climate governance. So I think that's extremely important for now and also for how we do climate policy going forward. I think the other thing, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, you mentioned it for all its flaws, and I actually have a personal sort of reservation when it comes to this mechanism, but I think it has really given the EU a way to talk about industry decarbonization, trade decarbonization with major partners, major emitters, major trade partners that we hadn't seen before. Now, obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act has accelerated that even further. The EU's way of doing that was more maybe low-key and bureaucratic.
the IRA a bit more with noise and oomph. But it's really, I remember us as E3G sort of also looking, for example, into Russian processes of decarbonization before the invasion. And it was very interesting to see the kind of conversations and change the CBAM did, even though it wasn't law yet at that point, really stimulated in those economies. So that's a positive. And I think that's really important, despite a lot of shortcomings on that as well. In terms of where I think we didn't get to where we should have, I think one very general point, the Green Deal always had a social aspiration as well. I do not think we have fulfilled that. I would have hoped that the Green Deal really has a transformation of logic from going from sort of setting standards and compensating vulnerable consumers afterwards to a situation where we actually make it possible for every individual, in particular the most vulnerable, to be able to choose climate-friendly services and products rather than having to do so and then being compensated, right? I think that flip in logic we haven't achieved. And I think there's some homework to do in terms of bringing people along. Having said that, support for climate policies is still high, but I think we can do better, and it will only do us sort of a favor in the longer term. The other things I wanted to quickly point out on sort of where we are falling perhaps behind expectations or behind also the new geopolitical reality, which is the IRA, so the Inflation Reduction Act, and also Putin's invasion. I think some elements of Fit for 55 haven't really caught up with that. I think, Christopher, you pointed out the Renewables Directive and energy efficiency ambition. We had a lot of heads of state support for Repower EU, but that didn't necessarily translate into heads of state support for actually those targets. And the council has sort of lagged behind on some of the headline targets on RED and EED. The jury is still out on that. We're in the final phases. I'm hoping that leaders can make that connection going forward. But that's one thing I wanted to point out. The other thing was really, and sometimes to the point that it's amusing or almost absurd, the gas package seems to be very isolated from the rest of the Green Deal and also from the geopolitical reality. Now, Repower EU sets out that we would reduce gas consumption by up to 50% in only 10 years. Fit for 55 would only be 30%, but it's massive. It's a third to half of our gas consumption would be wiped out within 10 years. The gas package is not preparing us for that. It's not talking about transforming our networks, downsizing our networks, decommissioning to help reduce consumer bills. It's not talking about a targeted use of hydrogen where we really need it, because Christopher, you were also saying, we can't import it at large scale. We really need to make the best use of this resource, and that is largely in industry decarbonization, a few other uses. So we cannot afford to just, spread it into the networks. And I think there we're making a bad choice for European industry decarbonization if we don't create that clarity we need. And I feel like the Green Deal is not very consistent across the board here. So I'll wrap up here. I think one final piece that I'm just getting from international partners, the EU is doing a lot of good stuff. It's doing some confusing stuff, especially now with also the crisis response for international partners. So sometimes it's also not clear to international partners where exactly is the EU heading. I think the EU needs to invest much more also in communicating what it's doing and where it's heading. To bring others along and inspire others. But yeah, I'll wrap up here and happy to take questions later.
Thank you, Lisa. Jesse.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Chris. Thanks for the invitation. I'm pretty much on the same page as you, Lisa. First, this is amazing. Even 5 years ago, in 2018, when Primes published the first 1.5 degree aligned modeling, which was still then ahead of any EU target, it was sort of exploratory modeling, it was unimaginable that we would be where we are today. We have this massive package, and the packages used to be 5 or 6 pieces of legislation. That diagram, Chris, is of a scale I think I've never seen before, at least in the EU environment, climate, energy field. We've got a net zero target, we've got the climate law and the scientific advisory body, so we actually have a fundamental structure guiding the way forward, and I think that's really important, Lisa, as you highlight. And then with that, we've got the taxonomy, the corporate regulations, the CBAM, so we've got definitions, we've got a framework for market protection, green progress. And I'll come back to the CBAM in a moment. That's all great. But I also agree with you, Chris, that there's a fundamental challenge with the efficiency and the renewables. Not only are we way behind target on these, but these are fundamentally things that happen at national and subnational levels. The EU can facilitate, but it can't drive. We're looking at building standards. We're looking at permitting. And we need a tripling of pace of wind growth onshore and offshore. Huge permitting challenge. A lot of that has not yet been addressed in the member states. And you can see politicians are still a little nervous about going where they need to go. On energy efficiency, we've been trying to do energy efficiency in buildings since the 1973 oil crisis. Now we've had another reminder that we need to do this. But we're still at the point where we're offering compensations because we can't think how to actually deploy modern, comfortable, cheap to run housing upgrades, which is what really we need to talk about if we're going to achieve energy saving. And Lisa, I think you're right. There's a lot of social politics around that too, which is also going to take thinking and a lot of political investment. And that, again, can't really come from the European Commission. It has to come from elected politicians close to communities in the member states, in the regions. Then we come to the external dimension. And Andres, I'm glad you highlight this because the world has been watching and is, the word is confused. Confused by Europe's climate announcements, but then its short-term energy security measures. Now, if you're closer to the picture, we understand why what is happening. But when only headlines are seen from capitals in emerging economies on the other side of the planet, it looks contradictory. And let's not underestimate the ripple effects of the CBAM. On the one hand, we have the IRA in the US, and that, frankly, is superb news. The US is moving. It's moving in a very American way, using American legislative tools, but great. This is an enormous signal. It perhaps puts Europe a little bit on its mettle to then match. And we've seen the speeches at Davos in the last week about a green industrial strategy in Europe. But the CBAM has also been perceived in those emerging economy capitals as protectionist, exclusionary, and I've actually picked up a lot of anger in response to it. And I think here in Europe, we've seriously underestimated our communications challenge on what we are trying to do with the CBAM. It's both a protection measure and a climate action measure. But we haven't matched it with climate finance, just a list of long broken promises. And that means that we are now in a situation where we are seen as essentially having a green plan for Europe, to which there is no opportunity to onboard from the point of view of emerging economies that can't instantly meet European standards. And this is a problem that actually ripples throughout the package, RFNBOs. Perhaps companies feel in emerging economies that they can produce something that meets most of the European standard, but not all of it. And at the moment, they see themselves entirely locked out of the European market and European business opportunities to do the green investments and the new green fuels that we're asking them to do, but not to do them exactly the way that Europe has decided it wants to do them within European borders. And we've got a lot of work to do in that space in the next years. Gas package, electricity markets, let's come back to that because I think that's going to be a really exciting and important area, again, for implementation going forward. Andres, back to you.
Thank you, Jesse. Ronnie.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting discussion, very interesting picture. And yesterday we asked Christopher to send us his slides to prepare the whole thing, but lucky he didn't do that because his slide is impressive, but at the other hand, it misses a lot of things. And this may sound very bad. It clearly puts down the legislative work, and Christopher is fantastic on that. But what it misses is the cross lines. if there is a line on taxonomy, it goddamn impact the whole thing on energy efficiency. It impacts how you make a taxonomy on what is green and or what is not green, and what is green electricity and what is not green electricity. It does impact RED 3. So what is really missing, and what I'm very happy that I saw this slide, it explains to me an awful lot of things. There is silos in the whole thinking, and those silos are extremely dangerous. Thank you, Christopher, for the appreciation of the work we try to do on, is there enough green electricity? This is one of those things, one of those crossing elements. And that is what is missing, this system approach. And I'm an engineer, sorry for that, but that is what we are talking about. How are we going to get there? And I made some notes. If I look at ETS, you say now that we will bring transport under ETS. I'm already driving 7 years under ETS. I'm driving an electric vehicle. So there is some things in that energy choices that impacts the whole policy on other lines. If we tomorrow would swap all cars to electric cars, the ETS explodes because we get 30% more electricity demand, which is under ETS. So how are we going to balance that transition in those whole things? How are we going to be sure that if we take a measure in one direction, it doesn't blow up another part of the system? The same with green hydrogen. If we are going to produce 10 million tons of green hydrogen within the EU, we get a demand for electricity, which is massive, which will increase the prices of electricity and will increase the demand for electricity in such a way that we cannot electrify what we need to electrify to get the energy efficiency. Another point where I saw a line in between is if we are going to electrify, if we are going to do that with more electricity, we get immediately 60% more efficiency in driving. How are we going to do that in legislative package? All those cross anchors. For me, it's very impressive to see the things, and I'm sure that people that are in legislative work are calling this impressive, but I'm scared because I'm thinking that all of those lines will be established in the greatest detail without looking across the wall. It was mentioned by Christopher that the wind energy sector already is scared of not getting where they need to go due to the lack of resources. It was also said in that there is a lack of resources in renovation, which is by Theodoros Zachariadis already mentioned in the chat, where he said with so large labor shortage among Europe and acute demographic challenges, how are we going to get there? So this is very important. How are we going to automize the renovation wave? Without industrialization of that automation of that renovation wave, legislation is not going to work. And a last one, which is international and which is missing, if we are looking at the offshore wind is rather international. We are looking, for instance, at the UK. Most of the offshore wind is quite close to the UK. How are we going to set up the grids in the North Sea? We need their legislation that makes that possible. Otherwise, we can build wind turbines without having a connection. And a final point which I want to make is CCS, CCU. It is somewhere pushed away. Without CCS, CCU, we can forget the decarbonization rate that we need by 2030 in industry. That's what I hear from my friends at the chemical plants in Antwerp, we need to have that CCS in the toolbox. Otherwise, we are missing a major tool in the whole legislation. And these are some technical points, Chairman Andries, that I wanted to make as a technician. Looking at IRA and further international, also what I see, we have to be very clear on that. How are we going to wheel and deal with the people that have to produce our green molecules? How are we going to push them to give us space to do what we need to do? How are we going to convince them that they should give us space to produce clean water, to produce hydrogen that we then export from them without supporting them in their development of electricity, for instance? This is for me a very important thing on top of the other things which I already said, which will be difficult to understand and to explain them to our partners there.
Yeah, thank you, Ronnie. Before going in this implementation phase that Ronnie very clearly indicated the challenges are coming, I would still try to come to two issues that comes from the chat and is related to legislation. The first question, it's Christopher to you, but also to the panelists who would like to respond is this emergency measures. They have been adopted by particular procedure on relatively short times, like gas stocks, like demand reduction. So what is your view? Does it belong to 55 and should be prolonged? Or they should expire because it has been just emergency legislation that goes out by the date of expiration. So I think that is very, very good question that is coming. The second is, again, this divide between fossil era and renewable era. It is somehow Energy Charter Treaty is the one that is somehow still taking some part of the public discussion. Lisa already answered on the question, but I would like also, Lisa, about ECTs that you give to the whole audience. What do you think about this modernization efforts? Can it be modernized at all? Or things that have been related to fossil era could be modernized good enough to respond to 55 challenge? And the third issue that I would like you to address, it is this Inflation Reduction Act. All of you there have already mentioned one way or another this. They have basically two questions. One perhaps is rather easy to answer from Juan. Do you see that Inflation Reduction Act as a retaliation measure response to European CBAM? Do you foresee other economies worldwide reacting in a similar way? So, and then there is a question, what should be EU's response to IRA? Or is there any response needed? So will it be part of the Fit for 55 question? So basically three questions that I would like to put in front of you. So I will start with Christopher, then Lisa, Jesse, and Ronnie. Pick one of these. Christopher.
So on the expiration of the price caps, tricky. So we have gas prices around 60, 65, and if anybody has a crystal ball that tells me that they are going to stay there, then we should get rid of everything. However, they are at 60 to 65 because we've had a mild winter, because we have the expectation of additional LNG capacity coming on stream, both at the productions and the import level. The new terminal in Germany, the additional one's going to come on stream, and the fact that China is sleeping by China's standards. The storages are fuller than they've ever been at this time of winter. So we've been incredibly lucky. All the stars are aligning that we will stay here, but it is never certain. Anybody who says energy markets are certain are likely to be proven wrong. And if we have a perfect storm next year, though we have an unusually severe winter, if we have China waking up and consuming a lot more LNG, if we have Russia cutting off the remaining supplies that we do get through Ukraine and Turk Stream, and if, for example, we have another political global event of some kind, then we're back to very high gas prices. So on the one hand, there is merit because, okay, today the inframarginal price cap doesn't have much effect, if any. The clawbacks shouldn't have much effect. And there is a big downside to these measures, which they create enormous investor uncertainty, particularly for renewables producers, renewables generators. You don't know what on earth a government is going to impose next year. And we've seen in some member states clawbacks and charges which are difficult to rationalize, shall we say. And this kills renewables investment. We've seen it time and time again. We've seen it when Spain did the ex post change in renewable subsidies. We've seen it again. So this is tricky. But I think that there is an argument to keep them in the background, but really to try and make an effort now to giving industry more certainty about their investment. This also comes to the electricity market design review, but I won't go down into there now for the reason of time. Can I just add one more thing on the Inflation Reduction Act? The thing we don't like in Europe about the Act in particular is the fact that in order to get the tax breaks, so you get a basic tax break if you invest in wind, for example, or hydrogen, but then you get another supplementary tax break if you use a certain percentage of American-made components. And that's the bit we don't like about it at the end of the day, because it goes against our fundamental principle. But this is one of the things I was going to say to something that Lisa said, which is, I remember in 2009 when the EU started its renewables push, and the big sell at that stage was this is an industrial opportunity. We will be the center of the global PV panel industry. We will be the center of the global wind industry. Well, we blew the PV opportunity, didn't we? We had a huge opportunity there and we blew it. And Europe, it seems to me, needs to, I often think Europe is a vegetarian in the world of meat eaters. And we're so careful to be correct in the WTO that we don't look after our own interests. And I personally feel we should be a lot more aggressive in turning what we're doing in subsidies and everything into making sure that we are the industrial leaders. And so perhaps we should take a leaf out of the Americans' book and be a little more aggressive about turning our investments in renewables, hydrogen, energy efficiency, zero carbon buildings into global leading companies, be more Chinese, shall we say.
Thank you, Christopher. Lisa.
Yeah, and as a vegetarian,
as a vegan, perhaps.
No, just very quickly, maybe picking up on the IRA, and I think the question was also around, is this a retaliation measure? I think it's important to remember this was born out of very specific political context in the US, where doing it that way was the only way to get agreement on climate measures in the Congress. So I don't think it was a specific retaliation measure. Having said that, I think it was clearly born out of the recognition that we have to do something that the US is starting to lag behind actually on some of those industries, and that they need a way of leaping forward. And very quickly, I know we'll have more time to discuss this later, but I think what's important now for the EU is, on the one hand, to be much more deliberate on the industries that it does want to grow. I do agree with you there, Christopher. I think at times the EU's main tools in this is, like specifically thinking about Brussels here, is policy certainty and consistency and giving clear direction, right? And so going back to my hydrogen example earlier, we need to be really quite clear about the direction and maybe remove some of the inconsistency that's in there at the moment. And I think that will be an important part of the EU way of doing industrial policy. But it's also really important that the EU uses this as a way of actually not only competing with the US, also competing with the US, but also working with the US towards a global conversation around how we're greening industrial strategies around the world, how we're greening trade around the world. I think this is a really actually excellent setup. The pie is quite big, the potential pie. So I don't think it's only about sort of either you get it or I get it. It's really quite a big pie. So I think that's an opportunity to learn from what we haven't done on CBAM, which is basically upset most of everyone else, and those who could responded, and those who couldn't, were really struggling and losing sort of trust in Europe as a partner. So I think there's one step further the EU can go if it wants to continue to use green policy also as a way of building global relationships and exerting sort of global leverage. Very quickly, you asked me to respond on the ECT and just the Energy Charter Treaty. So this is an agreement from the 90s, really, that gives investors the right to sue states if they've invested in another country, if there's a significant policy change and they end up losing some kind of expected revenue. The European Commission has invested in a modernization process of the ECT. It has achieved and has secured some kind of carve-outs. We've looked at them. I mean, I think it's really important. They are not sufficient to really align with the Green Deal. And it's really important to remember this is an instrument from the 90s. The reality has really changed. European governments, including, are intervening much more in energy markets. And actually, it's an instrument that, especially where investments are a little bit smaller, it does not really contribute in any way to investment certainty. There's so many other things that are much more important. And at the same time, it exerts really a significant regulatory chill if countries want to start phasing out fossil fuels. So I think the best course of action for Europe is really to actually get rid of this instrument completely and think about what are the infrastructures and architectures it wants to build globally to really help spur clean investment. But this is really, it's a fossil, it's a legacy of another time, but I think the world has moved on and I think we can be quite confident to do that. And then I'll stop here, Andres, and hand over.
Yeah, thank you. Jesse.
Thanks. I thought I'd pick up on first the question about emergency measures. In addition to the emergency measures on gas, we've had a number of other ones, particularly throughout the power system. And I think we need to look at some of the emergency measures and essentially set a standard. Those that are aligned with our net zero transition commitments, we should keep. And those that are not, we should absolutely not keep any longer than we need to. Two examples. As we have had, and I'm sure we will have again in the future, this is going to be a challenge. Last summer, we had power plants struggling to cope with high temperatures and discharging water that was hotter than they were supposed to be discharging back into rivers and waterways. Regulations were suspended so that those power plants could keep operating. Several measures from the Industrial Emissions Directive have been suspended to cope with essentially the shortfall in gas. We've got gas plants running on oil, etc. These obviously we don't want to keep. So I think we need to look across that whole emergency package and say, what's a step forward that was taken in an emergency context, and what's a step backwards that was taken in an emergency context, and how are we going to not remain backwards, but recoup at least the ground that we've lost in terms of particularly environmental protection, or perhaps move forward, recognizing that we are increasingly seeing infrastructure, frankly, struggling, not just with energy security issues, but with climate conditions. Second thing to come to the CBAM. Look, there are countries that can set terms toward the world, and there are countries that are takers of terms created by other countries. The Chinese have their own strategy, Chris mentions. They may well respond with their own border measures. Why would they let the Europeans collect revenues when they can perhaps collect them at the Chinese border? Certainly, Chinese expert friends are commenting in this direction. That's a very different situation than that of South Africa, Pakistan. These are countries that feel very much that they are locked out, that they can't lock the world out from their own economies because they are simply not big enough players. And I think an interesting case is India. I've just come back from a fascinating trip to Delhi. And while the world in general is angry about the CBAM, the mood in India, I would say, is 2 or 3 times stronger. And I think we need to sit down as Europeans and listen very carefully, particularly to India, about what it understands the CBAM to be, do our best to explain what we think it is, and measure the impacts that it has so as not to trigger, frankly, a breakdown in relations in the whole climate energy space. So we will see reactions, but I think we need to engage with those reactions. And clearly, there will have to be some data to this too. One of the things I'd like to see Europe do is invest in supporting the gathering of data about impacts over the implementation period so that the CBAM can be reviewed, can be adjusted, as it will necessarily be done, but in a meaningful way based on greater knowledge than we had so far. Last quick remark to pick up on, perhaps in a transition the direction of some of Ronnie's remarks. What a net zero target fundamentally means is an inversion of the energy system. And there I think Ronnie's absolutely right that we are struggling to accept the scale of the challenge and actually deliver. It's an inversion from a world where we had energy-dense molecules and we turned some of them into electrons from fossil fuels so that we could run electric lighting, charge mobile phones, to a world where we intend to run the energy system on electrons and convert some of them into green energy-dense molecules where we need to do so. That's a totally different infrastructure. It's a totally different set of markets and economic forces. And it's a massive, massive deployment challenge. And in this context, if Europe's going to support any industry, it needs to look very urgently at its wind sector. This is the equipment manufacturers of wind turbines, where the value chain in the wind industry has become so tight that if you sit down with equipment manufacturers in wind and say, we need you to triple, we need you to quintuple your production, they say, look, we're losing money. That proposition at the moment is that we triple our losses. We have become squeezed by auctions to the point that we are desperately unprofitable. And if we can't expand profitably, then they are simply not going to be there to meet the targets. That has not just European, but also global implications. Because again, move to South Africa, sit in Pretoria, you're being told to build out wind. It's a much better proposition if you can trade off offers from American equipment manufacturers, European, Chinese, than it is if you've got only one offer. And at the moment, it looks like Chinese are supporting their wind sector in a way that we are failing to do in Europe and until recently have been failing to do in the US. Andres.
Thank you. Ronnie.
Yeah, and there's a few things. What I hear more and more from the colleagues is that infrastructure. And I see a lot of debate. Give you an example of Belgium yesterday, where the Green Party was opposing a hydrogen pipeline because it would be able to transport gray hydrogen via that pipeline. So do we really want to wait, and do we really want to see grids being developed based on the final solution of 2050 that all electricity and hydrogen has to be green by then? So I'm missing an awful lot in the discussion, the transition. And the transition means that we are now somewhere and we want to be in 2050 somewhere else, but there is a road in between them. And we need to develop, and that was Jesse was saying too, we need to develop that infrastructure for that. And I'm missing the fact that we cannot stop all things now and by tomorrow switch to the other thing, the other world. It will take time. And one of the things which I'm really puzzled of is how the reaction of Europe is towards the gas bubble in Cyprus. Why are we not using it? We are squeezing to death Pakistan and other countries where the electricity system is breaking down due to the lack of gas because they can't afford it. we will not get an awful lot of applause around Europe for our policy if we are doing that, if we are not taking our act together here. And if I look at policy, if I look at a very important thing is mining policy in Europe. I see lucky that the Swedish will now produce rare earth metals in the north of Sweden. How can we still have the whole idea that we should not pollute in Europe and import materials from somewhere else? So this has to change if we want to have that energy system, new energy system in Europe based on renewables. We have to do what we need to do also here and not always look at import. That's something that CBAM is, for me, puzzling. We need imports. We need to have those flows, but if we want to avoid import, we should try to see what we have here, as we do with renewables. And this comes then to the gas pipelines, which was said, we have to build that infrastructure, and we have to build infrastructure which is really long horizon. And there is only one infrastructure that is long horizon, which is electricity. And we need to build those grids. And what I'm really looking forward to is how CBAM will work with importing or discussing or trading with the surrounding world on material for power systems. We are if we want, and I appreciate a lot what the wind people are saying, that they lack money, they lack everything, they are pushed to the limits, but the power industry needs to multiply its output by a factor of 10 to accommodate the transition. And I'm missing that in the picture of Christopher. I'm missing that. How are we going to get our industry, not the present industry, ready for that new system, but how are we really going to make the industry and put the industry in the picture in Europe to deliver the products that will be needed by 2050. And that's what I'm seeing with CBAM and with IRA. I'm seeing now the Americans buying technology in Europe to produce in the US the new technologies which are needed for 2050. And we are selling them. We should nourish that industry here with materials, with the whole thing. And that's for me the contradiction between CBAM and IRA, is how to make the industry here that will produce it, and not doing the same thing as we did with PV panels, inventing the whole thing, setting up the first industry, and then having the production done in China. How can we have that industry stay here, remain here, flourish here? And CBAM, for me, is not the right answer.
Yeah, well, thank you, Ronnie. Before moving to the final part, there is very nice analysis in a couple of sentences is done by Daniel Brinkworth in chat. He basically says, well, there is no political risk concerning climate change in the EU. So that's fully agree. I saw this development. It's a mainstream, and whatever party comes and wins elections, it will stay committed to this. Some more, some less, but there is no ways. But at the same time, EU's legal construction is rather challenging. So there is this legal uncertainty. There are many targets. At the same time, well, how you bring this implementation in, how to create the situation of legal certainty. Because IRA, for 10 years, you at least know how you invest. In EU, you still need to build up mechanisms, and this most of mechanisms very much will be mentioned in climate and energy plans, but not necessarily that governments will follow what they have put in the plan. So my question is to Christopher and all three panelists, what is the main principle EU should follow that this Fit for 55 is really implemented and achieved with less possible costs? What is the main advice that you would give? Yes, impressive package, well done, but now it's implementation. How we can manage really to deliver what we have put in this legislation? So, Christopher.
I disagree that there is no political risk in Europe. I think there's huge political risk in Europe, but not in the way that the question is posed. I don't think there's any political risk in Europe that we will set targets in 2032 for 2040 that are commensurate with 100% decarbonisation by 2050. I think there is huge political risk that we will actually, that the member states will implement the measures that are required to get us to 55% in 2030. I think there's a huge political risk that member states will not implement particularly the buildings measures, and something that Lisa said on social elements. It's all very well having an obligation of member states to require people to upgrade their buildings to category D by 2030. That's great. The problem is that hits the poorest members of our society the hardest. A, because rich people can afford to do it. B, most rich people live in a building where they've already got insulation, double glazing, etc. So that, I mean, this is a huge challenge, and I'm personally skeptical that we're going to hit our res targets with the commensurate of member states. I'm just really, for the reasons that we've discussed, industrial planning, investment, because the real focused determination of member states, I don't see it. I don't see the real determination of member states to do this. That's why I love the IRA. I wish the EU had an IRA, personally, to make life easy. So I talking to companies, I hear the sucking sound of investment going to the US from Europe. So I think there is considerable political risk in Europe, but of a different level than we're thinking. Because it's very easy to set targets, it's very difficult to make them happen. So in terms of what can be done by this, I think the reform of the state aid rules are extremely important. I think the idea of a European mechanism or fund in order to try and do this is very important. I think the EU has been, this is a personal opinion, too technology specific in its energy policy until now, by pushing renewable hydrogen above blue hydrogen. Admittedly, blue hydrogen is a fool's bet at the moment. But on all the other issues, I believe the market, as the Americans have done, they basically said, if it cuts CO2, let the market sort it out, you get the tax break, you worry if you get it wrong. So I would personally like to see a much more focused approach in terms of delivering the targets rather than setting them. And that, I think, involves a lot around the national energy and climate plans, and the EU having the courage. I think this is probably the most important. The Commission having the courage, when the kneecaps, I think they're reviewed this year. When they are reviewed this year and next year, that the Commission really has the courage to look at each and every one and say, sorry, it ain't going to add up. It ain't going to add up. And really then have a proper debate at the EU level that in 2024, saying we are not going to meet these targets, or we are. But I think, honestly, the time has, as I said, there's an awful lot of compliments that need to be done on this legislative package, but it's a legislative package of targets, not action. And I think we now have to get serious and ask, do we actually have the measures in place, number one, to make sure these targets are met, number two, to do so in a cost-effective way, And number three, to make sure that they deliver jobs in Europe, not jobs in China or the US or wherever.
Thank you, Christopher. Lisa.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting observation. The main point I wanted to add to that is, I mean, I think there's a question on, you know, what is the role of the state in terms of removing risks for businesses, and what kind of risks need to be removed? And I mean, I think in the end, we also need to some extent, let the market work. So obviously legal certainty is important. But I think the EU has delivered in the past in terms of transformations, despite sort of the complexity of how it operates, and businesses have been able to adapt. So I'd possibly be interested to hear more about where you see this to be fundamentally different now. I think where the EU, and this is then follows on from Christopher's point, perhaps falls short is in sort of consistency and really following through on certain things. And this is really for me that the key thing in terms of following up on last year's Repower EU. Targets were set, sort of a big idea was given, some money was also mobilized. Where we are starting to trip over are things that are really related to delivery. Now we're seeing, for example, solar installation rates go through the roof. We're seeing heat pump installation rates going through the roof. Unfortunately, I don't have data on energy efficiency, but we're seeing a massive acceleration. But what we're not seeing is, for example, a drive from the EU level to say, now please, everyone at DSO level, go out and assess whether your grids are ready to connect those. Can we please count up the number of electricians we have to sign off those installations so we can do that in time? And can we make sure the big ticket infrastructure is ready as well? So ENTSO-E, please produce a plan for 2035 net zero infrastructure. Please work with the UK to make sure we're actually building the infrastructure we need to harness offshore wind, be it grids or hydrogen infrastructure, but please work together, because otherwise we get a suboptimal outcome and are much slower than anticipated. And those things are missing. And I think that it's really going back to the emergency measures question earlier. The emergency measures were there to get us through the moment and buy us some time to really think about how we design the next 2 to 3 years, because prices will not fundamentally come down to the level we've seen before over the next 2 to 3 years, because we won't have that much more supply. Even your Cyprus, it won't start supplying significantly in that time. So we need to really get that delivery right. And what I think we're missing at the moment from the European Commission, from the Council, is to say, okay, how can we shift all those task forces we've set up for securing supply to actually look at how do we ensure delivery really works of the clean energy solutions that will then actually mean we don't need that much additional supply out there on gas in particular. How can we, I think it's coming up with the market design. How can we ensure we really digitize the grids so we don't bake in more gas than needed in terms of supply flexibility? Is something where the EU is really lacking behind, and where we're lacking a strategy. So I think there's a few, I agree, we need to actually really flip to delivery, ensure the delivery over the next three years really works. And we need that plan for that. We need the institutional structure for that. And we're missing that at the moment. And that is infrastructure, that's digitization, that's skills and labor supply, where I think the EU can play a significant role, but where we really need to shift gear. So I think in that sense, I'd be interested in a follow-on discussion from that, but I think it's maybe a little bit less about legal risks, and it's about actually supplementing the legal piece with other pieces that come along in terms of transforming the economy.
Thank you, Lisa. Jesse.
Andrew, so I think you asked a really fundamental question, which is, this is going to involve colossal costs. We have some modeling of that, we have analyses, but we haven't started to come up with a delivery plan to address those costs. To that extent, I think I echo and perhaps underline something both Lisa and Chris have said, which is sort of, and it's very much the context of Ronnie's remarks, that the package as we have it is more of a roadmap than a delivery plan. It's absolutely essential, but it doesn't get us to where it's aiming to get us yet. Let's pick this issue of housing and efficiency in housing. A German business leader told me he was fitting heat pumps to his house. Very proud of this, doing excellent work. He also told me that he was spending 69,000 euros on this. Now, that's obviously not something that most households in any European country can ever consider. Perhaps the most important statistic I learned, and it was at an FSR meeting earlier last year, was from TNO in the Netherlands. They had done a study finding that around 8% of people in the Netherlands live in energy poverty, defined as can't pay the electricity or the gas bill at the end of the month. Now, obviously, those numbers have moved with what's been going on with prices. And it's not a good number for a rich country, but it's probably manageable as a total societal challenge. 48% of people in the Netherlands, however, half the population, live in circumstances where they can't afford the capital investment to change their energy situation, to install windows with proper insulation, to change to a heat pump. These sorts of measures are out of the reach of half the population. We simply don't have the beginning of an answer to that challenge yet. So we're at the next stage where we've got real about the targets, we've got real about the legislative and regulatory implications, and now we need to get real, as Ronnie's saying, about implementation. A lot of that's infrastructure and a lot of it's cost. And I think we are still really quite early stages in understanding the task that we've set ourselves. And there's a lot of work to be done, yes, by the European Commission to analyze that and to come up with initiatives that can support it. But once again, we really, really need to move on this in the member states at national and subnational level. And that's where I'm most worried.
Thank you, Josie. Ronnie, what is your advice? Sorry, Ronnie, are you in or?
Sorry, it was mute. Okay.
Yeah.
My advice, Chairman Andres, what I see is, and I think it's coherent with what Jesse was saying, there is some targets, there are some things, but there is no plan. I'm going to make it clear. The grid, everyone recognizes that the electricity grid is the major challenge. Okay, and it's not that I'm a power engineer that I'm saying that. I think that most people see that. What you get is the 10 years development plan of the EU, legally binding every 2 years, a revision, etc., and a line X and a line Y, which is subsidized by European funds. There is no zero, nada plan for how the grid should look like by 2050. We have done a planning at the Research Institute, and you need 20 gigawatt lines all over Europe with 40 big nodes, where you have a high voltage line crossing the Benelux with no connection in the Benelux. How are you going to convince people that such things have to be built? They are really supranational. Where is that basic plan of the infrastructure by 2050? I don't see it. And this is the plan that we need. Where is the industry going? What do we need? What do we need in mining? What do we need in pipelines? What do we need in type of fuels that we need to have airplanes going? People that if now I'm looking at the present legislation, what they say is you need blending. You need blending fuels in shipping. But at the other hand, people are saying shipping will be with ammonia. You can't blend ammonia. It's a step from X to Y at a certain point. I don't see that transition. I don't see where are we heading for? What infrastructure do we need? How are we going to get that fuel into the harbors? How are we going to get whatever it's going to be as a fuel for flying to the airport of Riga, of Vilnius? I don't see it. And that's what we need. And as long as we don't need that, we cannot have secured the investments to get us there.
Yeah, thank you, Ronnie. What was very clear. Before passing to Ilaria, I would just mention that the legislation is definitely going in the right direction, in my opinion, and it is definitely the one that is European type of legislation. But to get from point A to point B, I think all the governments and the EU institutions should follow what Ronnie says. There are some measures that definitely does not make things more complicated for member states to do their own activities, but that are absolutely necessary really to deliver results that we would like to have by 2030 or 2050. And this we need to crystallize in the debate how the package should be implemented. And it's not too many things. It just, you can't, Ronnie usually says you can't change physics, laws of physics. Politically, you can change for a short while, but for a long period, that never works. So that means that you need really to distill things that require more effort, and the things that require less, it definitely could stay through the national climate and energy plan to be implemented. So it's not that we need to take everything for European level, but there are a couple of things that really need to do it. And with this, Ilaria, I will give the floor to concluding. I would, from my side, thank you for all the panelists and also for Christopher for very, very interesting and useful.
Thank you very much, Andris. Yes, I join you in with a big thank you to Christopher for making a really good and comprehensive presentation of the status quo in energy policy and legislation, and also all the panelists, because it was really a rich debate. My main takeaways, I think there was a general appreciation, I would say, of the Fit for 55 package. We all agreed that it still goes in the right direction. The direction is still correct. So in the direction of achieving the climate targets and in the direction of the Green Deal and decarbonization. But there were also at least two big statements, two big warnings. First of all, I think from Ronnie, let's not forget what he called the cross lines. Let's not forget that we have to abandon silos thinking, and that all these measures that were now in Christopher's picture are all interrelated. So this is something that is definitely to keep in mind. And number two, we need implementation. So the Fit for 55 is an excellent roadmap, but we need really a concrete action plan and steps. Mainly to avoid legal uncertainty and to make sure that we meet these targets. There are several challenges to be addressed in the next months, so we will see. But the main thing to keep in mind is that more certainty, more transparency on the way forward facilitates investments and helps green investments in particular. So I think that the key points were infrastructure. We mentioned infrastructure is a key point of this plan, and costs as to reduce the risk of energy poverty even more. So there's still a lot to work. I think that's the conclusion. We have to stick to the objectives that were included in the Fit for 55. Maybe gas is a little bit aside now, as Jesse mentioned, and that needs to be brought back into the vision, particularly the hydrogen and the infrastructure development. I haven't heard much about still the emergency, and I take it as a good point. It feels like we feel out of the big risk, out of the big emergency period. That is good. But of course, that is also still in the picture, and hopefully the risk is reduced, but we are not completely out of energy crisis yet. So still months ahead of big importance and big developments. I thank you very much, and I have no doubt that we'll keep working together on these issues in the course of the year. Thanks a lot.
Andris, Ilaria, thanks for the timely debate.